Okay, I think that we have start now. Welcome to the session Social and Cultural Activism. My name is Artur Markowski and I am senior historian at the POLIN Museum. And it is my great pleasure to be a chair of this session. We have three presentations and I would like to introduce all participants just before the presentation. So first is Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska, who is associate professor at the American Studies Center, University of Warsaw. She is specialized in 20th century social and cultural history and of the United States and Poland. Her areas of research include women's and gender history, transnational history of reproduction and public health, and history of social movements. She's an author of many important and interesting articles, and also including two books. The last one is Children, Families and Gender Roles in American Humanitarian and Philanthropic Initiatives in Interwar Poland. Topic of her presentation is Being a Jewish Birth Controller in Interwar and State-Socialist Poland, the story of Herman, Rubinraut, Henryk, Babiniak. So, Sylwia, the floor is yours, and please remember that you have 20 minutes.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction and thank you for coming to this panel. And in academic discussions on Jewish social activism in various countries of Europe or in the Americas, the initiatives in the sphere of reproductive politics or reproductive activism, they are pretty rarely mentioned. And if scholars have debated Jewish reproductive politics in the 20th century, they usually have focused on Jewish women as activists of family planning movements or as patients in birth control clinics or other facilities that provided contraceptive advice. However, in case of Poland, this was a Jewish man, not a woman, Herman Rubinraut, who played a pivotal role in the interwar conscious motherhood movement and who drew the attention of the general public to the fate of women overburdened with incessant childbearing. And in my paper, I would like to scrutinize the reproductive activism of Rubinraut, who positioned himself first and foremost as a Jewish social activist, whose aim was to alleviate the suffering of poor women, mostly from the Jewish, but also from the Polish community. And one of my intentions is to examine this notion of Jewish leftist politics by bringing reproduction and sexuality as topics of interest. And my main source of information of Rubinraut's personal and professional life is the correspondence with an acclaimed American birth control activist, Margaret Sanger, and this correspondence was maintained by Sanger and Rubinraut for nearly 30 years. So they started in the 30s and finished in the 1960s. Besides, I will also rely on Rubinraut's publications, such as brochures on birth control that he published in Polish and in Yiddish, and as well as articles intended for mainstream as well as for more professional audiences. And using these sources, I will seek to find out what were Rubinraut's personal and professional motivations for the involvement in the conscious motherhood cause, and what was the role of Rubinraut's Jewishness in his birth control activism. And before I concentrate specifically on Rubinraut's reproductive activism and his personal and professional motivations, let me talk briefly about birth control activism in 20th century Poland, so just to get us a bit of background or context. So birth control movement in Poland was born at the turn of the 1930s during the discussion of the new family code that was to modify legislation regarding abortion. But the focus of the debate very quickly diverted from the termination of pregnancy to its prevention, and the prevention of pregnancy or family planning was quickly diagnosed as the best solution by the activists and doctors who were involved in the discussion. And there were two main groups that were publicizing on this cause of conscious motherhood and who were spreading birth control information. And by the way, spreading birth control information was legal in Poland at that time, and it was not always the case in some other countries in Europe or in the Americas. And the first of these groups of birth controllers were Polish socialists who published articles in their periodicals and who in 1931 set up first birth control clinic in Poland that was situated in Warsaw at Leszno Street. And so here's the picture of this clinic. And the second group were literary critics and artists, mainly writers, who were connected with the famous magazine Literary News. And this magazine in 1932 started to publish a supplement on birth control entitled Conscious Life. And I am mentioning these two groups because Rubinraut had quite close connections to both of them. It is also important to emphasize that in the interwar years, birth control activism encountered a lot of opposition from the Catholic Church, as well as nationalist groups in Poland who deemed conscious motherhood immoral as well as unpatriotic. However, as I have argued elsewhere, the idea of conscious motherhood met a much warmer response of the Jewish community in Poland, as some Jewish activists, Rubinraut including, identified birth control as a certain solution to several issues that Jews were facing at that time. And just finishing this background information, let me stress also that the birth control movement revived in Poland in the post-war years, in the mid-1950s, and this time it had approval of the state, of the socialist state. And I am mentioning this fact as Herman Rubinraut, who after the war changed his name into Henryk Babiniak. He attempted to get involved in post-war birth control activism, but with much smaller success than in the interwar years. And let me now emphasize a little bit regarding Herman Rubinraut's bibliographical information. So he was born in Warsaw in 1894. We do not know a lot about his family, apart the fact that his parents' names were Maria and Zeskind. And well, for instance, in the file of the Jewish Historical Institute, like the father's name is like Zygmunt, right? So depending on the sources, so the spellings, pronunciations of these names are different. And Rubinraut's family was probably not fully acculturated as he knew Yiddish, and at the same time they had to be quite well off, as Herman was sent to study medicine in Austria. And there he graduated from the University of Graz in 1921 at the age of 27. And then he nostrified his medical diploma 4 years later at the University of Warsaw. And in 1925, he became licensed to practice medicine in Poland, what he did for several decades, specializing in gynecology and obstetrics. And at the turn of the 1930s, Rubinraut became involved in the birth control movement in Poland, co-funding first conscious motherhood clinic in Warsaw, where he advised on contraception with a Polish female gynecologist, Justyna Budzyńska-Tylicka. In the 1930s, he published widely on birth control in the periodicals that were issued both in Polish and in Yiddish. including the aforementioned supplement to literary news Conscious Life, but he also had articles published in the Journal of the Society for the Protection of the Health of Jews, Social Medicine, or a Jewish daily published in Polish, Our Review. So he managed to publish in several different outlets. And at that time, so in the early 1930s, Rubinraut also produced 2 booklets that propagated birth control and advised on contraception. The first one, Effective and Safe Methods, Effective and Safe Contraceptive Methods, was published in 1931 in Polish, and in the same year it was translated into Yiddish. In 1934, Rubinraut published his second pamphlet, twice as big as the first one, and this one was published only in Yiddish. It was entitled Wake Up Jewess, How to Prevent Undesired Pregnancy, and the Yiddish booklet, it was never translated into Polish, and Rubinraut, as we can get it from the letter to Sanger, he regarded this as somehow too bold for the Polish market. And at the end of the 1930s, Rubinraut was divorced and had no children, and was attempting to emigrate to the United States with the help of his American correspondent, so Margaret Sanger, but these attempts were unsuccessful. He survived World War II, for the most time hiding in Lviv, and then returned to gynecological practice after 1945, when he again lived in Warsaw. And as his post-war immigration attempts also turned out to be futile, Babiniak, as he was then named, became one of the co-founders of the revived Society for Conscious Motherhood that was, however, in his opinion, overtaken by young activists who craved for power and recognition in the movement. So there was obviously this kind of generational shift in the birth control movement in Poland at that time. And now I would like to discuss main principles of Rubinraut's reproductive activism that are visible in his publications as well as in his correspondence with Margaret Sanger. And I argue that Rubinraut's involvement in the birth control movement in interwar Poland was characterized by the emphasis put on Jewishness, as well as by feminism and the awareness of the role of social class and the concern with conditions of the poorest women. And one of the questions I would like to pose is connected with the relation between these characteristics and Rubinraut's personal and professional experiences, and generally his biography. And starting with the first principle of Rubinraut's reproductive activism, let me emphasize that despite advising all women in conscious motherhood clinic and publishing also in Polish magazines, Rubinraut was first and foremost concerned with the role of birth control for the Jewish community, and particularly Jewish women. The decision to focus on contraceptive advice and propaganda among Jews was undertaken by the activist because of the political, social, and economic situation in Poland, where the Jewish community was affected by poverty, immigration pressure, and looming threat of Nazism, as well as the fear that Hitler's politics would find followers in Poland. And he actually enumerated all of these concerns directly in one of his letters to Margaret Sanger. And as he also wrote to her, and by the way, so this is like the original transcript of the letter with all mistakes retained, he wrote that to the Jews, one can write like the plain truth without compromise, without fear to hurt swollen national ambitions, without risking to be a soldier extirpator. On the other hand, is there better propaganda for the whole proletary of the country than to state, that families who control their numerosity are getting on better, are healthier. So as we can see from this letter, Rubinraut regarded contraception as one of the measures that may solve Jewish question in Poland and that may improve the conditions of Jewish families. And at the same time, concentrating on the Jewish community, Rubinraut hoped that birth control campaign that was begun among the Jews by himself would bring good results to all women in Poland and for the whole working class of the country. And this last supposition leads us to the next characteristic of Rubinraut's reproductive activism, namely emphasis that was put by him on social class. And Rubinraut's relative affluence, in one of the letters to Sanger, he openly admitted being rich. So this affluence did not limit his social perspective and did not prevent him from acknowledging that these were the poorest women who suffered most from the lack of access to contraception. In Wake Up Jewess, Rubinraut admitted that in the past contraception was the privilege of the rich women and that doctors sold contraceptive devices and products for a lot of money. And the aim of his brochure was to change it, but providing practical information on contraception to the most destitute Jewish women who were too poor to pay a doctor for contraceptive advice or who could not afford a trip to the clinic that was situated in Warsaw and where, by the way, a patient had to pay for counseling. And Rubinraut was aware that 3 or 4 zlotys that a woman had to collect to pay for a pessary, so this type of diaphragm that was fitted in the clinic to women that were coming for advice. So these 3 or 4 zlotys, it was like a sizable sum of money for patients from poor communities. So he advised such women irrigations and other cheaper methods that were to suffice for the time when money for pessary was being collected. And the focus on women in contraceptive activism, quite common in birth control movement at that time in other countries as well, is not the only reason why we can argue that Rubinraut's reproductive activist was feminist. And Rubinraut's feminism is particularly visible in his Yiddish brochure, where he advised traditional Jewish women to postpone procreation if the marriage was not financially stable or if they were of poor health. And more tellingly, Rubinraut put the decision regarding contraception solely in women's hands. As he argued strongly in Wake Up Jewess, so this is not the one that I wanted. This is not the one. Okay. Yes, this is the one. Okay. So the methods of preventing pregnancy should be the private matter of women. This issue should be treated seriously. Generally, this is better if the woman does not tell her husband about contraception. It happens quite often that the husband is afraid that he would lose something from his inebriation due to the reason the woman is preventing pregnancy. The methods of contraception are harmless, so it depends solely on women's discretion and delicacy, so the husband does not find about them. So that's what he wrote, right? So trying to encourage women to keep their contraceptive practices in secret, Rubinraut somehow prioritized women's health and well-being over the eventual opposition of their husbands that might have had scruples stemming from some religious teachings on contraception that were not so unanimous in all strands of Judaism at that time. So how were this emphasis on Jewishness, social class, and feminism connected to the professional and personal experiences of Herman Rubinraut. The focus on Jewish community and Jewish women quite probably stemmed from Rubinraut's ethnic background. We can argue that being a Jew played a salient role in Rubinraut's activism and that ethnic origin motivated his professional choices. Interestingly, several other birth control activists and journalists who published on the topic in the interwar years were of Jewish origin, but they functioned mainly in Polish language literary circles, and they produced their articles with contraceptive propaganda only in Polish and for a more general public. And Rubinraut's publications in Yiddish distinguished him from other Polish Jews involved in conscious motherhood campaign, for instance, Irena Krzywicka or Wanda Meltzer, who identified probably to a greater extent with Polishness than with Jewishness. And what also distinguished Rubinraut from Krzywicka or Meltzer was his medical expertise in gynecology and obstetrics that provided Herman with direct contact with women whose health and well-being concerned him most. Gynecological practice and education differentiated Rubinraut also from other Jewish social activists who debated birth control in such periodicals as Social Medicine and who were less enthusiastic about the potential of family planning in mitigating the problems of the Jewish community. Last but not least, it was gynecological practice and contact with women, particularly of the lower classes, that might have contributed to the feminism and the emphasis of social class that were characteristic of Rubinraut's reproductive activism. And Rubinraut's ethnic background and the resulting focus on the Jewish community and Jewish women turned out to be one of the pertinent factors in his attempts to immigrate to the United States. And Margaret Sanger, who was to act as his visa sponsor, he emphasized Rubinraut's experience with the acceptance on contraceptives among various ethnic groups. So his expertise in birth control among Jews was to legitimize his immigration, which was to result in the cooperation with American birth control movement and further studies on contraception among different ethnic groups in the United States. So as I have tried to present, the life of the social activist Herman Rubinraut revolved around birth control, and Jewishness played a salient role in his professional undertakings as well as in his personal choices, such as the unfulfilled decision of immigration. And I believe that story of Rubinraut shows the benefits of considering the issues of reproduction and sexuality while discussing the involvement of Jews into left-leaning movements. And this story also encourages us to adopt gender as a category of analysis, what I haven't done so much in this presentation, but I think that this is something that we can do, and I think it's also worth studying men's gendered activism, so not only women's, but also men's, and Rubinraut's case is probably one to do this. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Sylwia, for the very interesting presentation. Now, let me introduce the second person, Andrea Feldman, University of Zagreb. Andrea is Associate Professor of History at the University of Zagreb. She edited the first collection of works in gender history in Croatia, in English, Women in Croatia, Women's and Cultural History. Also, she is an author of several books and articles. She taught the universities in Europe and the United States and also in Canada. And the title of her presentation is Circle of Vera, Erlich, Stein, Jewish Activists in the Interwar Yugoslavia. So, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I would like to thank the organizers at POLIN for inviting me here, and also for doing a very important work as they do in try to reevaluate the contribution of the Jewish people in Poland, but also outside in the sort of wider European and indeed global circumstances. Also, I would like to thank to our interpreters and also apologize in advance because I intend to cut my presentation, the one that I wrote and sent, quite substantially because obviously 20 minutes is not going to be enough to sort of present everything that I wrote. But I'm really thankful for being able to offer a comparative view on the Jewish experience in a different part of Europe at the time. I would like to discuss Vera Erlich Stein and her friends' involvement during the interwar period with the leftist policies in Zagreb and Croatia, then part of the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. I'm focusing on a woman who, during her lifetime, was a sociologist, anthropologist. Indeed, she founded a cultural anthropology at the Zagreb University. I think she was also a feminist, but under the time of our investigation, together with her husband, Benno Stein, who was a medical doctor, they were running a progressive salon frequented by prominent members of Zagreb leftist community. And this is going to be a sort of a focus of my presentation. I will also try, to a degree that I can, point to the connection of Zionist and Croatian, Yugoslav, and indeed European leftist activists and reveal their motivation as well as their ideological preferences at the time that witnessed the rise of fascism in Europe, as well as the strategies of the Comintern's Popular Front period. So obviously it's a challenge to do that without a further discussion of the context of Jewish experience in Yugoslavia, which was very diverse. In different parts of Yugoslavia, you had different traditions and different cultures coming together. I will leave all of that aside, as well as obvious differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardi, who were obviously there for a much longer period of time. I will concentrate only on a group of relatively young, educated people, part of the Zagreb elite, who followed in the path of their European peers and decided to take part in the immense change that was spreading over the continent in the aftermath of the First World War, in the trauma and crisis, economic as well as social, that ensued. Although their path was meandering and led them in different directions, it was inspired by most intriguing national ideologies of the day. These ideologies were Zionism, Croat and Yugoslav nationalism, that all mixed well with the progressive promise of communism. That is, with the idea of imminent world revolution that was supposed to bring about social justice. I'm not going to debate at length the circumstances under which Benno Stein came to Zagreb. But let us say that he came to Zagreb during the First World War as a medical doctor, at that time still as a sort of a part of the Austrian military, and stayed there. He studied at the University of Vienna and got introduced there with several other Jewish people that were all experiencing the similar fate. They were all from crumbling Austro-Hungary, whose changing political landscape forced them to experiment and redefine their Jewish, Austrian, and indeed Croatian identities in the new circumstances. So I have a quote here from Vera Erlich, one of the essays that she wrote about that, which she says for Benno, but I think it applies to most of them. The old Austria was a nurse to him, and Viennese medical school was a governess. From the Czech environment, he came from Czech lands, he acquired what was sober and practical, what was bon vivant and artistic, what was piercingly scientific. In that center in Vienna, that mixed Slavic tradition with Viennese culture, Slavic revolutionary zeal with solid Austrian traditions. Obviously, this was something that she thought was very important to stress in explaining the success of Benno Stein in Zagreb. He came as a medical doctor, and he was very, very soon after the First World War considered to be one of the most influential doctors, internist, and became the owner of a medical practice in downtown Zagreb. Again, she says in one of her essays, he was very modest regarding his personal needs, and he couldn't care less for profit. Although he was one of the most prominent physicians in Zagreb, more than half of his patients did not pay anything. If there was the slightest motive not to charge anything, he would do so. Poverty studies, his own relatives, as well as his friends' relatives and acquaintances, refugees, foreigners, beginners, or anything comparable was enough to refuse to charge a honorarium. As I said, Benno got married to Vera very early in the 20s, and she herself was a heir to one of the most influential Zagreb families. She herself says of her own family, it was the old Croatian Jewish liberal family of architects and builders who contracted many lucrative projects working for the state, both during the Austro-Hungarian times and during the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Vera Erlich was drawn to Benno's profound interest in medicine, which took him on different trips throughout Yugoslavia, and she explained his character in the way she really appreciated. She says, he hated, if his antagonism could be branded as hate, academic narrowness, scholarly snobism, patronizing of therapeutic attempts. He spoke about how some doctors are vain and costly, and do not care at all about the pains and suffering of the patients, that patients have every right to visit charlatans and sorcerers if doctors are being so arrogant. Anyway, this character of Benno, she explains, and the atmosphere of trust that emanated around him and Vera predestined them, in a way, for a complex role they played in the time of royal dictatorship, which lasted from 1929 to 1934. I'm going to say something about Zionism, which as a Jewish national ideology has gained a certain momentum in the interwar period as an organized effort on the part of the Jews to re-establish themselves as people in Palestine did not have many followers in interwar Croatia and indeed Yugoslavia. For example, out of 10,000 Jews that lived in Zagreb before the Second World War, only some 200 people emigrated to Palestine. Still, Zionism managed to revive Jewish life and families, and at the same time it revealed the fate of the Jews who used to be subjects of former empires, Austro-Hungarian in our case, and also obviously Ottoman. In one of her autobiographical essays, Vera would also try to clarify the Jewish identity and heritage of her family. She explored their activism in that period. And she says, for herself, Vera was a board member of the Jewish Academic Support Society, a delegate at the first Youth Congress in Osijek, and during many years active in the youth movement. She lectured at WIZO, and she actively engaged in taking care of emigres from Germany. So this is a part of her activism at the time. But was Vera an active member of the Jewish student organization since 1919? There is little information on her actual activism, and although Vera claimed to be a delegate, there is no record of it. The leadership of the Jewish student organization was clearly predominantly male, and Benno Stein, at the time her husband already, was elected as its president in 1921. The Third Jewish Youth Congress that was taking place in Zagreb in August of 1922 found Vera already married to him and not prominent among the speakers. But regardless, this incentive to spread the Zionist ideas came from young people, and it was also sort of focused and aimed towards the young people, mostly to the people that were already studied abroad, and they were those that actually entertained these ideas and brought them back. But also one needs to say that the post-World War Zagreb was the center of Zionist activities with its organization and quite affluent Jewish community. Among the students, this I want to mention for the benefit of our discussion, was even, among the students at the University of Zagreb, there was even a group of Polish Jews who founded a society, Berborohova, and some of them were the first to teach Hebrew in Zagreb. Other people who were influenced by Zionism were the former POWs, officers and soldiers, who got involved with it and with different communist ideas during the imprisonment in Russia. It is important to note another sort of stream of Vera's activities, aside from her obvious Zionist sentiments, and that is that already in 1919, when she was 22 years old, she felt confident enough to polemicize on the Jewish question with Zofka Kveder-Demetrovich, one of the first South Slavic feminists and an ardent Yugoslav nationalist. Kveder-Demetrovich, who edited and owned Jugoslavenska žena, I'm so sorry I didn't press this at some point. These are few photos about, here is the journal in question. Zofka Kveder was the editor of this this Yugoslav women-oriented magazine, and feminist, I think one of the first in the whole area. And she wrote a very specific essay on Yugoslav women and Jewish question. It is an insightful polemic which reveals a deep anti-Semitic streak at the heart of Yugoslav nationalist ideology, which Zofka Kveder advocated throughout her life. She accused, and let me just shortly sort of point to, she accused majority of Croatian Jews for being so exclusivist in their charity work, that is, they only help Jews. She went on so far to criticize their choice of profession, stating that they are strategically aiming for most lucrative professions, merchants, medical doctors, but not teachers, professors, or judges. She repeated a typical anti-luxury argument, condemning Jewish women for being too prone to expensive fashions and jewelry, and accusing Jews as, she quote, I quote, a harmful element in our nation. She claimed that they have been throughout their sojourn with the Croats, always siding with the power holders and against the people. Jews in Croatia have not produced the Heine to be loved and appreciated as the great poet was by the Germans. I quote, give us a Marx or Adler, and then you will see how proud we will be of them. But until now, you, Croatian Jews, have been mostly imbued with the foreign spirit. You gave us, I'm sorry, I know it hurts, but it needs to be said, many moneylenders, speculators, and inconsiderate exploiters of our country and our people, and only a few dilettantes in art and music. So it went on, and it was pretty clear that Zofka Kveder was trying to assess the kind of activity on the part of Jews that she considered to be inimical to the idea of national oneness, the core of Yugoslav nationalist ideology, which demanded that all existing nations in Yugoslavia should merge into a single Yugoslav nation. So her conclusion was to suggest to the Jewish compatriots to stay What you have been on October 29, 1918, this was the date of dissolution of all ties of Croatia with the Austria-Hungary, Yugoslav of Judaic faith. Although Kveder published a disclaimer at the end of her feisty attack, obviously expecting criticism and refusing to enter in any kind of polemic, she had received several letters but decided to publish only one, the one that was written by Vera Erlich. Vera's response was polite but firm, and she countered one by one all the accusations. She concluded that existing assimilationist tendency will not prevail because, and I quote, the last 20 years of the Jewish people's renaissance proves that Jews are not willing to assimilate. The Jewish people itself, its majority, and almost all of its youth, its future, is committed to the people's rebirth. And I'm not going to quote further, but let me just say that this is an example that shows that Zionism managed to create, however small in numbers, a new generation of Jews, a generation of committed people, upstanding Jews, Jews without folklore and without religious fear. Communism was another story. It attracted quite a following after the establishment of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia in 1919, but after showing quite a strength at the 1912 elections for the Constituent Assembly, it was quickly banned by the authorities, and from the promising 50,000 members fell to meager 688 in 1924. Factional conflicts inside the party, as well as difficulties of the underground work, in particular after the introduction of the royal dictatorship, led to the need to open up to different channels of communication with the interested audiences. Therefore, after the introduction of the Popular Front strategy, the communists used new tactics to allure young urban intellectuals to their camp during the 30s, and both Vera and her sister and their friends sort of came into that camp. They considered themselves to be what they called a part of particular society. On Sundays, they would meet at the hilltops around Zagreb, take a hike, take skiing trips in winter. During a week, they would attend public lectures at the university and listen to debates. Some of them were active in a freshly established working community for individual psychology. And this is when they got introduced to some of the sort of psychological authors, most prominently Adler and I will get to him in a second, Mane Sperber. Let me just say that while both Zionists and assimilationists argued, but for different reasons, against the Jewish participation per se in Croatian politics, the political left in Croatia received a very large contribution from the substantial number of Jewish intellectuals. This was possible in part due to the divisions on the left. The Social Democrats were discredited as Yugoslav unitarists and had little support in Croatia, and the Communists, as I mentioned, felt the brunt of the royal dictatorship. So their members were mainly in various prisons, and their agitational work promoted in ways that were at great distance from any minimum mass line. So there were writers, there were intellectuals that were prominent at the time, and it was quite possible that there was some place left at the party for intellectuals like Benno Stein, who at the time was probably a member of the party already. There is some indication that in 1936 he joined the party. But Mane Sperber, a disenchanted Austrian communist and Jewish writer, spent some time in Zagreb in the 30s and familiarized the European audiences with the Zagreb intellectual environment that he was introduced to by his friends Vera Erlich and Benno Stein. They invited him to participate at the meetings of their circle of friends and sympathizers, and their little salon was the place where they would meet. This was basically an apartment that was at the corner of two busy streets, and it seems that even hardcore communists, I have it, thank you, hardcore communists at the time, like Josip Broz Tito and Rodoljub Čolaković, liked to arrange some of their illicit business at Stein's apartment for at least two reasons. As first was apparent from his subsequent development, Tito did not mind enjoying the little privileges of a bourgeois shelter, especially when it was conveniently equipped with two exit doors. However, Tito was a rare visitor, probably because the environment was intellectually too demanding for his taste. Quite relaxed and informal at first, discussions and conversations among friends and intimates that took place there emerged to an intensive articulation of the social and intellectual issues of the day. Manes Sperber came to realize the immense national problems that were tearing apart the state of Yugoslavia. The brutality of the dictatorship, he compared them with Latin American dictatorship or Italian dictatorship, only served to increase the opposition to the Serbian hegemony. Censorship was overwhelming, the leftist press and literature were suppressed, and though few in number, the Croatian communists turned this unfortunate predicament to their own advantage. So I'm not going to go to the last part of it, which was basically dedicated to Vera's activities in sheltering people like Manes Sperber, who came to Zagreb from Germany and Austria. These were the Jewish refugees, and this is a whole sort of a new stream of activism that she really hold very close to her heart. She also wrote about this in the 30s in some of the Zagreb papers, and I will have to conclude that there is a certain irony in a belief of a progressive Jewish intellectual, the belief she shared with her circle, that they will be able to ensure a safe haven to the refugees from Hitler's Germany, and after the Anschluss, from Austria as well. It seems that their more than successful integration in interwar Croatia and its social setting left them for the most part isolated from the developments in Germany and unprepared for the horrors that are going to ensue in Croatia. An additional reason for it, as Vera's sister testified, the atmosphere of participating in an international interconnected community. There was no despondency but a preparation for a great solidary struggle. Although aware of the danger that fascism posed, they have not felt depressed but ready for a struggle for communal aims. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And it is my great pleasure to introduce the last speaker in this session. Vassili Schedrin is Alfred and Isabel Bader postdoctoral fellow in Jewish history at the Department of History at the Queen's University in Kingston, Canada. And he interested in social and cultural history of Russian Jewry from the 18th century to the present, including Jewish historiography and the history of Jewish theater in Soviet Union, and also Jewish emigration from Russia to America, the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Vassili Schedrin is an author of many interesting articles. I would like to mention his book, Jewish Souls, Bureaucratic Minds, Jewish Bureaucracy and Policy Making in Late Imperial Russia, 1850-1970. So, Vassili, the floor is yours, and I would like to tell that the title of his presentation is Solomon Mikhoels' Unwritten Autobiography.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I feel privileged to speak here, and let us start. Solomon Mikhoels is widely... Okay, that's better. Solomon Mikhoels is widely known today as a symbol of Soviet Jewish culture. Soviet king leader Jewish kingler of the Russian stage, an exemplary Soviet Jew singing a lullaby in Yiddish in a chorus of other exemplary representatives of the Soviet nationalities in the movie Circus. Today, Russian Jews remember Mikhoels as genius, the greatest Soviet actor, champion of Jewish national autonomy in the USSR, fighter against Nazism, and victim of Stalin's anti-Semitism. Mikhoels became a public figure in 1919 when, at the age of 29, out of virtually nowhere, he appeared on the Yiddish stage. He remained in the spotlight for the rest of his life until his tragic death in 1948. As a result, we know close to nothing about the first half of his life and a great deal about the second half. We know only half of Mikhoels. As Mikhoels noted, and his contemporaries agreed, he seemed to have no friends from his past, to hate writing and keeping any records, and to prefer live word of mouth. Hence, scholars paid little attention to Mikhoels' own voice, trying to explain his personality, life, and significance through external factors such as the outburst of Jewish creativity in the 1820s Soviet Russia and Soviet anti-Semitism of the late 1940s. I want to find Mikhoels' own voice and seek to understand his inner self. My goal is to write a biography of Mikhoels as an autobiography, the text he neither wrote nor even conceived of. In this paper, looking at Mikhoels' art, in which he, in his words, revealed himself, his thoughts, his perceptions of life through images, I am focusing on the important aspect of Mikhoels' historical significance, his widely acknowledged status of informal leader of the Soviet Jews. In the 1920s, Mikhoels, an obscure Jew and freshly minted Jewish actor, within few years became a star of the Soviet Yiddish theater in Moscow, playing leading roles on stage and leading troupe off stage. In these years, Mikhoels was increasingly recognized as a virtual icon of the Soviet Yiddish culture. It was Mikhoels, not his contemporary Yiddish writers, poets, artists, not Jewish communists and activists, who represented new Jewish life under the communism to tens of thousands of ordinary Soviet Jews who saw Mikhoels on stage and to hundreds of thousands more who saw him in popular movies. Mikhoels, acting, playing, conceiving new roles such as King Lear, Richard III, and Prince Ruben, used stage as principal means of addressing Jewish public and saw the theater as a principal meeting place where he met Jews and led them based on his singular vision of acting. In the age of mass politics, world wars, and social revolutions. In Mikhoels' view, actor was essentially a leader who leads the audience in theater and beyond it. As he put it, when actor engages and controls the audience, when he feels that he is a leader. And what does it mean to be a leader? It means to be in charge, to lead, and it's precisely this that actor seeks to accomplish. Mikhoels never joined the Bolshevik Party or any other party, lest his creativity is affected by party politics and external ideology. However, his art was political, based on political platform of his own, Jewish perception of life and Jewish attitude towards the ever-changing world. In 1919, Mikhoels wrote, "Fierce raged the tempest of revolution on the street, and human eyes and overly human thoughts flounced in fear and confusion among the chaos of destruction and haste of new construction. And at this very time, when entire worlds were cracking, dying, and being replaced with new worlds, it happened. It may seem something very small to others, but for us Jews, it was a great miracle. Jewish theater was born." In this picture, natural cataclysmic disasters, wind, earthquake, or revolution and chaos serve as a mere background for the true manifestation of the divine power, a miracle. However, in 1947, Mikhoels seemed to change his mind, arguing that human-made revolution created Jewish theater directly. Soviet power, he wrote, established by the Bolshevik Revolution, created the opportunity to build the first state Jewish theater in 1,000-year history of the people. During his career, Mikhoels, according to Jeffrey Weidlinger, historian of the Soviet Yiddish theater, while keeping a copy of the Bible on his desk and referring to it in his speeches, maintained a Janus-faced attitude towards religion. He could prate anti-religious platitudes, but his subsequent words and deeds betrayed him. One of these deeds will be the focus of my paper. The Soviet-made movie, The Return of Nathan Becker, 1932, to which Mikhoels contributed as a supporting actor and most likely as a co-screenwriter and co-director, will be analyzed as a fusion of the Soviet style of socialist realism and Jewish religious motives that underpin utterly the secular ideological import of the movie. Using this example, I will demonstrate that in Mikhoels' art, traditional Judaism, and in particular its messianic doctrine, intertwined with the secular ideology of the Bolshevik regime and its revolutionary anti-religious messianism. Paradoxically, in the context of the Russian Revolution, these two messianic ideologies, religious and secular, were not mutually exclusive. They were not only able to coexist, but also complemented, justified, and reinforced each other. In 1932, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, the Leningrad production facility of the Belgoskino studio released the movie The Return of Nathan Becker, starring David Gutman, Solomon Mikhoels, and Boris Babushkin. According to the movie's co-directors, they simultaneously produced two different movies under the same title, one in Yiddish, another in Russian. They also admitted that the movie's essential dualism created many difficulties, especially for the cast. Some actors knew no Yiddish, others no Russian. The movie is set in the late 1920s. Nathan Becker, a bricklayer who emigrated to America 28 years ago, returns to his native shtetl where his father, Tzale, played by Mikhoels, still lives. Nathan joins the other shtetl Jews, getting a job at the construction site of Magnitogorsk, an emblematic metal plant successfully completed during the first Soviet 5-year plan. As a skilled worker, Nathan is assigned to train novice builders. However, he struggles to grasp the socialist labor system and develops the wrong attitude. For example, he sees the socialist competition and his co-workers attempt to gain attention and the favor of superiors. To show off his American attitude and superior work method, Nathan challenges other builders to a bricklaying competition. One young worker accepts the challenge, and he and Nathan lay bricks in the circus in front of the cheering audiences. Defeated and broken, Nathan believes that he would be fired and sent back to America. His father convinces him that it's impossible in the Soviet Union, where workers are their own bosses. To his great surprise, Nathan is promoted and receives encouragement from the local party boss. The movie ends as Nathan, Tzale, and their Jewish co-workers enthusiastically lay bricks using the best Soviet and American techniques. The first critics of the movie noted its dualism revealed in the shaky balance between Yiddish and Russian, Jewish and Soviet. A few decades later, the movie's dualism was still evident to Miron Chernenko, a historian of Soviet Jewish cinema. While watching the movie, and especially when thinking about it after watching, I cannot stop sensing a dualism, wrote Chernenko, implicit in the picture. Its ideological focus and propaganda import was evident. At the same time, it seemed to be made for fun, not seriously, as if the movie makers, trying to keep up with the ideology of the epoch and to be loyal to the regime, could not restrain their Judaic subconscious that inadvertently added a certain oddity to the movie and discounted the message of the original heroic script. The dualism of the movie could reflect the dualism of the epoch. The Return of Nathan Becker was made around 1929. The great turning point year. The preceding decade, the 1920s, immediately followed the Russian Civil War that wiped out many traditional Jewish shtetls in the former Pale of Jewish settlement and caused mass migration of Jews to the largest cities of Soviet Ukraine and Russia. As a result, the traditional Jewish world of the shtetl, the Jewish past, was dying. while the world of socialism and Soviet society, the Jewish future, was not yet built. Therefore, the makers of the movie captured the Jewish present, a transitional period bearing features of both past and future, when Soviet Jews were still wandering toward their final destination. The Bolshevik Messiah, the Soviet Party state, was leading them. The party launched an unprecedented program aiming at the social transformation, that is, Sovietization, of Russian Jews. Both exploited and exploiters were to be recast, перекованы, into toiling masses, workers and peasants, enjoying free socialist labor. As a whole, Russian Jews, the former imperial minority, were supposed to become the Jewish people, equal members in the brotherhood of other Soviet peoples. The Jewish agricultural colonization of the Crimea and establishment of the autonomous Jewish Socialist Republic in the Far East were the key strategic initiatives in the field. Then why was the return of Nathan Becker a visual propaganda of recasting, перековка, set in the Urals and not in the Crimea or Birobidzhan? Why was the movie's plot based on a story about mythical Jewish bricklayers and ignored the real Jewish collective farmers and frontier explorers? Why is it about Magnitogorsk? The focus of the movie is not the real Magnitogorsk, but a mythical city built around Magnetic Mountain. Both the real mountain in the Urals, actually so-called, and a symbolic peak, serving as a spiritual beacon to the peoples of the world, like the biblical Mount Zion. Accordingly, the return of Nathan Becker focuses on the specifically Jewish spiritual aspects of the Soviet recasting, manifest in four main themes of the movie: return, people's unity, Messiah, and the Promised Land. Return is the central theme of the movie. The New York bricklayer and Russian Jew Nathan Becker, in his words, is coming home, returning to Soviet Russia from capitalist America. 28 years ago, most likely during the epidemic of anti-Jewish violence in Russia, the pogroms of 1903-1905, Nathan left his native shtetl, emigrated to America, learned masonry, and laying brick after brick, in his words, built New York. Now, in the wake of the Great Depression, obviously jobless, Nathan, his wife Meike, and his friend and co-worker African-American named Jim were going to the USSR. In 1929, when the American economy was in a deep crisis, Soviet Russia launched the first five-year plan, an ambitious program aiming at the industrialization of the economy and the modernization of society. Hence, skilled and experienced workers like Nathan were in high demand. Nathan looked forward to starting a new job and new life in Russia. While on the ship heading towards Europe, the excited Nathan examined his newly issued Soviet visa. He also raised his strong hands of a laborer and looked at them as a visa supplement, as he called it his party membership card. From a historical perspective, both Nathan's journeys from east to west in the early 1900s and from west to east in the late 1920s seem to be migration for political and economic reasons. However, from the perspective of the movie, only the first journey was a mere migration, while the second one, from west to east, was a return, symbolizing ascent to the Promised Land. Therefore, the return of Nathan Becker signified the end of the exile and the beginning of redemption. The destinations and routes of Nathan's journeys are an important aspect of the theme of return. In many cultures and literatures, including Jewish and Russian, journeys traditionally symbolized people's life trajectories framed by special temporal and spiritual dimensions. Thus, on a pilgrimage to holy places in the East, Western believers obtained holiness. Often, such journeys blazed the path to the future. In 1799, Nikolai Karamzin, the Russian writer who traveled to Western Europe seeking true enlightenment, published the account of his journey called Letters of the Russian Traveler. According to Karamzin's contemporaries, his book was read as an account of Russia's future. According to Jewish tradition, the future of the Jewish people is firmly linked to the lost Promised Land in the East. Hence, the Jewish future is a restoration of the Jewish past, and the return to the past is a way to the future. Therefore, the return of Nathan Becker to the USSR, the journey to the East, and the resulting spiritual improvement, the recasting, symbolizes the dawn of the redemption. Jewish tradition views a reunion of the dispersed Jewish people returning to the Promised Land as an important integral component of the Messianic era scenario. In the movie, the theme of the people's unity is represented by the family reunion. Nathan's return to his father Tzale is a symbol of the Jewish future attainable by a return to the Jewish past. Thus, the modernized and Americanized Nathan and his traditional shtetl father reunited. Moreover, the reunion could be seen as a resolution of the old conflict between fathers and sons and a reversal of the trend of disintegration of the traditional Jewish family described by the classic Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem in a series of short stories about Tevye the milkman. Leaving home, all Tevye's daughters built their own families and homes and hoped for their own future. Nathan's reunion with his father reversed the imminent disintegration. The family reunion symbolizes the restoration of the people's unity. In the USSR, Jews once again become one people with one goal and one future shared with other Soviet peoples. Returning to his father's home, Nathan returns to his childhood, to be re-educated through recasting and to grow up to become a new kind of adult. Therefore, Nathan throws baby-like tantrums just because he dislikes physical education. Like a teenager, he is extremely vulnerable and overly emotional when confronted with tough life situations. In contrast, Tzale, his father, patiently and gently pushes his son in the right direction, only rarely complaining about Nathan's stubbornness in embracing new Soviet family values. "You always argue with us, Nathan," he says. In the first half of the movie, Tzale obsessively measures Nathan's spiritual growth with a folding ruler that he keeps in his breast pocket that is closer to his heart. If the return of Nathan Baker ushered in the Messianic era, then who's the Messiah? The echo of this question and possible answer could be found in the short story Schiffskarta, written in 1922 by Ilya Ehrenburg, the prominent Soviet writer of Jewish descent. Another tale about the Russian Jewish family, a Berdichev watchmaker, Girsch, Ichenson, and his son living in America, divided by Atlantic and by destiny. Girsch believes that America is the promised land, as he receives an infrequent correspondence from his son, who, quote, might forget the native language or might be using words in God's language. Everything will be all right, he writes. Schiffskarta, the ship ticket, will come to you year after year, and in times of trouble, this word become to Girsch a consolation, an unpronounceable name of God, a God's smile. However, instead of anticipated Schiffskarta, civil war, fear, and death come to Berdichev, and Girsch perished in a pogrom. Obviously, Schiffskarta is Ehrenburg's metaphor of the false Messiah, who enters sons of Girsch Ichenson and Tzale Becker to America, the false promised land. This is why Schiffskarta, the false Messiah, didn't come to redeem Russian Jews from the turmoil of the Civil War, nor did it make Russian Jewish immigrants, such as Nathan Becker, happy in America. It's also obvious that the Bolshevik Revolution symbolizes the true Messiah in the movie. Its coming is invisible, but it's revealed in faithful and profound changes shown in the movie. The revolution was the turning point of Jewish history, dividing it into exile past and messianic future. The world of exile is orderly and essentially material. Time goes by measured by hours, days, and religious holidays, such as Sabbath. Meike, Nathan's wife, remembers their last Sabbath in America, when they saw jobless people quarreling in a long line to a soup kitchen in New York. The messianic world is metaphysical. There is no time in the normal sense. In Magnitogorsk, Meike struggles to understand how to measure time in the USSR, how to differentiate between weekdays and holidays, what is the day off, выходной, and when, after all, does the Sabbath begin. In addition to changing time, the Promised Land, the last theme of the movie under consideration, reshaped space and affected people's lives. Nathan's entire shtetl seemed to instantly move from the former Pale of Settlement to Magnitogorsk, as if space shrunk and there was no more 2,500 kilometer distance. Upon arrival to Magnitogorsk, people immediately started to build. What did they build? According to Jewish tradition, upon the return to the Promised Land, Jews would rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount in the city of Jerusalem. The movie hints that former shtetl Jews would build a factory where everyone gets a job near Magnetic Mountain in the city of Magnitogorsk. Panoramic shots from the movie do not show any actual buildings, but a vast construction site with colossal towering scaffolded structures. During his first day of work at this enormous job site, Nathan, who used to simply lay bricks in America, learned that Soviet bricklayers should approach their work with an attitude similar to the traditional Jewish attitude toward prayer, called the holy work, Avodat Kodesh in Hebrew. Soviet builders' rituals include such rites unheard of in exile as the socialist competition and physical education. Initially, Nathan mocked this ritual as theater, but in the end, he wholeheartedly embraced it. Thus, the holy work in the Promised Land forever changed Nathan. In the final scene of the movie, he excitedly acknowledges that Soviet builders built with their hearts and souls. In Magnitogorsk, atop the scaffolded tower, Tzale, Mikhoels, nods approvingly to Nathan and starts singing a nigun, Hasidic prayer without words. Soviet messianic ideology and Jewish messianic tradition peacefully and even harmoniously coexist in The Return of Nathan Becker. The movie, like other contemporary Soviet pictures, such as Chipaev, 1934, and Circus, 1936, was framed by the stylistic canon of socialist realism, showing the transformation of ordinary human into the ideal Soviet citizen, and thus mythologizing the reality, portraying it in a way it should be, not in a way it was. In terms of the Soviet formula of a socialist national art, socialist contents in national form, on the one hand, The Return of Nathan Becker seems to fulfill the ideological imperative to infuse Jewish art with the spirit of builders of Magnitogorsk. On the other hand, in the case of The Return of Nathan Becker, it's hard to differentiate between contents and form. Whether, for example, Mikhoels's nigun, Hasidic melody, at the end of the movie represents Jewish form, or whether the idea of the USSR as the Promised Land is the socialist content. As the analysis of Solomon Mikhoels's contribution to Soviet Yiddish art has shown, following the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, he perceived revolutionary changes in Jewish terms with religious underpinnings, wholeheartedly embracing the revolution for Jewish reasons framed by Jewish messianic tradition. In Mikhoels's eyes, the revolutionary politics of Bolshevik regime supported Jewish aspirations, promising redemption to a living generation of Soviet Jews. Hence, as a messiah, the Russian Revolution warranted the Jewish future. Supporting the Messianic Revolution by means of Soviet Yiddish theater and film, Mikhoels created a modernist art that was as Soviet as it was thoroughly Jewish. From this perspective, The Return of Nathan Becker was not meant to be a historical document of Soviet industrialization, nor outright propaganda of recasting, but rather a multi-layered image of Jerusalem, a rich metaphor of the Jewish future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vassili. So now I would like to give the floor for the discussion. Please remember that we have simultaneously translations, so you can use both languages, English and Polish. So questions or
very brief follow-up question on Vassili's talk. What was the role of Mikhoels in creating the movie? How was he involved in writing the movie? I mean, he played in it, but did he write it?
Maybe we'll got a few questions. Okay. So next question or.
I have a questions for each lecturer. First to Mrs. Markowska. Do you think that the engagement in birth control from the Jewish activists was because lack of the background of Catholic religion? And to Professor Feldman, could you say something about the post-war and about the Holocaust of Vera Erlich and her activity, where and what she did after war? And to Professor Schedrin, what is the recognition of Mikhoels in Russia now? Because he's a top of mind for me, for example, as a Russian and Jewish actor, and he's well known in a common sense, but I don't know nothing about his recognition now. Thank you.
More questions? Yeah. Okay, so maybe the first round of the question will be end. So.
Okay, thank you for the question. It might have been connected with their lack of having to follow the Catholic teaching on contraception, right? But the teaching, like some strands of Judaism, also criticized family planning, right? And on the other hand, there were some activists who were at least raised like in Catholicism and who were getting involved into the birth control movement in Poland, right? So it might have been connected, but not necessarily, right? So this might have played a role, but this is my guessing, right? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. Obviously, the scope of this conference was interwar period, so I didn't really want to go further. But both Vera and her sister survived the Second World War. They were in a different ways. Vera managed to leave Zagreb in time and joined her sister, who actually joined partisan movement. Vera herself was not as active in the partisan movement, but at certain points in time their paths crisscrossed at the island of Vis when it was liberated territory in 1944. Then they moved on to Italy when it was already liberated, and Vera stayed in Italy from 1944 to 1949, working with UNRWA, with relief services, and also helping the refugees that came from liberated concentration camps in different parts of Europe. So she worked with the refugees, which is basically continuation of her work before the war. Then she briefly visited Israel in 1949 and continued to the United States, where she stayed for around 10 years during the 1950s. Then she decided to go back to Yugoslavia and Zagreb, and came back to Zagreb, tried to restore their family property, failed, but managed to kind of squeeze an apartment in the upper town where she lived with her sister as well, until her death in 1980. Benno Stein repeated his fate. He was again called as a medical doctor to Yugoslav army at the point, the Army of Kingdom of Yugoslavia, but was apprehended by the Germans in the first phase of the war in 1941. Unfortunately, he committed suicide, thinking that as a Jew, his doom was to be sent to concentration camp. I'm saying unfortunately because this is not what would have happened. Most of the Jewish officers in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia military, as well as Jewish doctors, were basically treated as POWs and were not sent to the camps from Yugoslavia. So he committed suicide in 1941. At the time, they were already divorced, and he was married for the second time. Vera decided not to marry, and she stayed single until 1990.
So she had any connections with Tito regime after war?
Well, first of all, she was never member of the Communist Party. She was very well connected to some of them, and she tried to, when she came back in the 60s, she tried to use the connections and influence of some of the basically major communist operatives in Zagreb, trying to get the estate back. But their villa, a part of it I showed, the swimming pool, I think, I showed in the photo. The villa was already turned into an orphanage, and they never got back this property. But as I said, you know, they were very well connected, but obviously of a leftist inclination, but they were not party members. And this was, to my mind, one of the reasons why she really, in the post-war period, did not receive the role that I think was rightfully hers, because, as I said, she came from the United States, obviously not a very popular country for better part of the post-war period. She tried to publish some of her works in anthropology. She managed to do that with the one book which is called, and it's still in print, Family in Transition. It was first published in the States and then republished, or actually translated into Croatian. She also published a textbook on cultural anthropology in 1968, but a very important, I think, book of her own anthropological research into American lifestyle, way of life, and she was not able to publish during her life. So there was a sort of a mixed bag of attitudes and connections with the communist regime.
Tolerated by her personal connections, but only to some extent.
She tried to use it, and she always claimed that she and her family was very well regarded by the most of the Zagreb people, by her neighbors, you know, by people that she met in the streets, in the banks offices, in the post offices. She would always say that whenever I say the name Erlich, there is this flair of the old days, and people have this respect for the things that my family did. Obviously, this was so in the post-war period, in the 50s or in the 60s when she came back. Today, this family is really known only to a very, very narrow part of the society, mostly to art historians, people that deal with architecture, because the family was really a family of builders. They built a huge number of very important buildings in Zagreb, and obviously this is not something that can be totally neglected. But as her work in anthropology, she is pretty much, again, quite unknown still.
Could you tell a little bit about the Jewish situation during the war in Zagreb? Because you said you were in Zagreb, and it was Ustashi regime. I don't know nothing about how was the work.
Okay, maybe it will be question for the second round of, okay? And now, Vassili?
For the sake of time, I had to omit a lot of context of this presentation of the movie. Technically, it's the script is written by Peretz Marques, and later, after the movie, Marques published not exactly the script, but a novel under the same title in Yiddish, and then translated to Russian. So we have the extended version of Nathan's story in 2 languages. But the script is under clear influence of Mikhoels' own thinking about Jewish future in the USSR, and I make this conclusion on the basis of analysis of his other works that he did in the very beginning of Soviet Yiddish theater in 1919 and 1920, when he wrote his own play, his only dramatic work called The Builder, about the building, the story of the Tower of Babel, very symbolist and pretty short drama. And just one illustration of from this analysis, the final scene of Nathan Becker, where they sit atop of this tall scaffolding, and he sings, and they have this conversation with biblical allusions about building with their hearts and souls instead of bricks and mortar. It coming directly from Mikhoels' play written in 1919. And a lot of his acting is also based on that. And it's very strange. It's not a coincidence that whoever speaks about the movie starts with dualism, because he plays in a very symbolist manner, and he plays a shtetl Jew. It's very very hard to get, and it's only explained with the help of many other texts. As for Mikhoels' reception today, I could say that in the past 10 years, at least 3 documentaries about Mikhoels was made and aired on Russian TV, but mostly focusing on his role as the victim of Stalin's regime, and because there is a lot of mystery surrounding his death in Minsk in January 1948, and it's a sort of detective story. This is why it's pretty attractive, and the Jewish component of it is not like played in those documentaries. He also figures in the documentary series made by Leonid Parfenov, the one major Russian TV host and now documentary filmmaker called Russian Jews. This story also is in there, but Mikhoels' theatrical credentials are also recognized. So his name is known not only as this victim of Stalin's regime, but also as the great Russian Soviet actor. And I would say that very recently, the building of Mikhoels' theater, Gasset, the State Yiddish Theater in Moscow, is now occupied by the theater called by the address, Theater na Malой Bronной, theater at Malая Bronная Street. And its new artistic director, Konstantin Bogomolov, who just assumed the position of the artistic director there, established the foundation named after Mikhoels to sponsor theatrical projects. And I would add that very, very recently, to mark this year, 1919, is 100 years of Soviet Yiddish theater, because the first performances happened in summer 1919 in Petrograd, and then eventually theater moved to Moscow. And this past Monday, November 25, Mikhoels' play, The Builder, was performed in Moscow for the first time in 100 years.
Okay, next questions or remarks? A few persons.
I have a question for Ms. Kuźma-Markowska, because you stress very much that your character was focusing very much on Jewishness of his patients, but then he decided to stay in Poland, as I understood, after the Second World War. What made him not to go? Because it's quite contradictory.
Professor Schedrin, I was there in this theater this year on May, yes, and I saw it. He's recognized now very, very strongly in Soviet Union. I have another personally. What do you think? Question. What do you think? This Nathan Baker's story. Accidentally, my family is Baker. So Nathan's Baker's story is a product of Soviet propaganda, or the people, the Mikhoels and Perez Markish and Moshe Kulbak and Der Nistar and so on, they really believed in this ideology?
Izam Żegut, University of Warsaw. So I have questions for Mrs. Kuźma-Markowska and Mrs. Feldman. And I would like to raise the problem of transfer of knowledge and some transnational aspects of activists and this activism. Sylvia, you examined also this American birth control movement, and you said that Rubinraut studied in Graz. So do you see any inspirations or some transfer of knowledge between Austria and the USA? And maybe do you see, for example, some influence of the Polish birth control movement on the other Jewish societies in the Central Europe, for example? And additionally, could you elaborate a bit on this male gender aspect of the Rubinraut's activity? And for Professor Feldman, could you say, because you told us about this Viennese inspiration and this Viennese roots of Erlich, and so do you see any inspirations or for example, some influence of the Austrian Social Democrats in the interwar period on your heroes? And for example, I would like to ask you whether the Red Vienna was the important point of reference for Erlich, or it wasn't any inspiration for them. So thank you.
Okay.
Danny Walkowitz from New York University. Not quite sure what I want to say about the Sanger papers we edited at New York University, as you probably well know. I guess I would be more interested in knowing whether the campaigns that you trace have had any legs. That's to say, do they resonate at all in contemporary Poland, which has a fairly conservative political culture and would be deeply embattled, I presume. The second question from Mrs. Feldman. Anthropology went through major transition in the 1920s. So to simply speak of her as a cultural anthropologist doesn't really explain very much, doesn't really locate her in a transition which only was experienced at Columbia University and not very much, not any place else particularly. And much of cultural anthropology during the 1920s and 30s was still pretty retrograde and deeply embedded in all kinds of nationalist traditions and notions about primitivism that went back into early folklore studies. So I'd like to have a better sense of her as an anthropologist and where she fits into that story. And then finally, around theater and representations of Jews. I guess I'd like to have a better sense of how not simply that he's lionized or not lionized in the Soviet, in Russia today, but rather how is he representing Jews? And how do people understand those representations? So we see a picture of him in Lear. Is he ever in Merchant of Venice? And does he how does he represent, or as a playwright as well as a director, Jewish women, not just Jewish men? And given that he's dealing with certain shtetl representations, we could imagine this is not unlike some of the real deep problems that are associated with the dominance of Fiddler on the Roof images. So it would be useful to have a sense of what is attractive or not attractive in the representations of the Jew that he demonstrates.
Thank you very much. I think that we have to give a few minutes for the authors of presentations. So, Sylwia.
All right, so thank you so much for all the questions. The answer to the first one is very brief and simple. So I didn't say that Rubinraut decided to stay in Poland. What I've said was that he was not able to immigrate, right? So basically, Margaret Sanger was no longer interested in helping him, and probably she was like the only link that he might have like relied on, right? But he was still interested. So in his letters, like from 45, 46, we can see, especially that his like war experiences were really traumatic, as he hid with his lover and her husband in Lviv, right? So that this is like a pretty well-known story, and so he simply was not able to do this in the like prior to the war and then after the war. And as to Isa's questions, so basically in the interwar years there was the whole international birth control movement with like several different countries and activists from these countries involved in it, and these were like the English and Americans who played like the most visible role in the movement, and they organized like conventions in different countries of Europe. Margaret Sanger traveled like to Asia or to Africa even, right? So there was this whole network, and certainly there was this transfer of knowledge regarding activism as well as contraceptive methods, but I haven't heard of any transfer between Austria and the United States, unfortunately. And but certainly Rubinraut was like cognizant of what was going on in like German-speaking countries, so he corresponded like with some physicians from Germany, so he was pretty well acquainted with these efforts as well. And whether there were any influences of the Polish birth control movement or the Jewish like part of activism in other Central European countries, so I haven't found any traces like in the sources that I have like examined of this. Then what I meant by gendered analysis, and especially in regard to masculinity. So what I think would be like interesting is like to scrutinize certain visions or models of masculinity that birth control movement was propagating. So in terms of what was seen as like good behavior or like bad behavior, so what were the visions of the proper like Jewish or Polish male behaviors in terms of reproduction of sexuality. So this is what I think can be like an interesting angle of analysis. And then the contemporary situation in Poland, what I think is like an interesting link between the interwar activism and the discussions that we have contemporarily is quite a big emphasis on social class, right? So today it is being more and more emphasized that, especially in relation to abortion, right, which is like the very, very heated topic in Poland, that these are the women from like lower strata of the society who suffer because of the legislation, right? So it was like quite similar in the discussions in the interwar years when it was being told that like well-off women, they are able to go to a doctor and get like a contraceptive advice, whereas the women from like the most destitute groups, they simply cannot afford this. So I would say this is a kind of resonation, but in the interwar, they debated mostly like contraception. Today, we have problems with abortion mostly. Thank you.
Okay, there were several questions. So just briefly, as far as the Second World War experience of the Jews in Croatia and indeed in Yugoslavia, it was unfortunately not much different from everywhere else in Europe. So it's a big topic. It has been researched to a degree. What has not been so much research was the experience of the Jews that survived and what happened to them after the 45 and after the communists took power. Because out of, I think, around 8,000, 9,000 people that survived, some 5,000, so majority to a degree, left for Israel after 48. There were 4 aliyahs, and to my mind, they were encouraged to leave. Mostly because in the eyes of the communist rulers at that point, they were regarded as bourgeois, middle class, higher class, whatever. And they were also encouraged to leave without their assets. So they had to leave all the real estate behind, factories, and basically property. So this is something that has not been written to mostly in post-Yugoslav literature so far, but there are a few dissertations written on that subject, and we trust it will be better known in the future. Another thing is that the partisan movement that received quite a contribution from the Jews, there were quite a few of them, I don't think respected that contribution to the highest degree. So most of the leading position in the partisan movements were not occupied by the Jews, and indeed there is only one famous Jewish, yes, Moshe Piade. Again, you know, his contribution was very relevant in the interwar period, but he stayed mostly in the prison during the interwar period, and then later he was promoted as basically a token Jew, I think. As for the issue of Red Vienna and the possible transfer of knowledge and the transnational aspect of this, of course, this was an important part of it. A second wife of Benno Stein was Valeria Singer, who was a social democrat and a fierce one. She was previously married to one of the other communist activists and actually a musician, Pavel Markovets, who changed his name in the 20s. So obviously this experience was important for the whole circle, not only for individuals. I think that what is also important is that they managed to get introduced to the modern ideas of the period, the psychology or Freudian psychoanalysis. These were the sort of sciences that really inspired sort of Marxists to think about what is going on. And Vera, and now I'm coming to the third question. I didn't say she was anthropologist at the time. She became anthropologist in the United States. The thing is that at the time she was influenced by psychology. She was very much into educational sciences. She was thinking about ways in which to improve the kindergarten system at the time, and she wrote on Montessori method and some other issues. But she was also, at the time, during the 30s, she started a very big research project on the issue of family relations in the Yugoslav villages. And she made a substantial research of 300 villages in different areas of Yugoslavia, Kingdom of Yugoslavia, from Croatia, sort of along the coast of Dalmatia to Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, and Macedonia, and also Montenegro. So aside from Slovenia was left outside, but basically Yugoslav rural population was covered in her research. What is interesting is that she worked on that in collaboration with the school teachers. She managed to involve school teachers, also some priests, to basically give a sort of as objective as they could assessment of the life in the peasant families. And she managed to capture, this was why her book is so important, she managed to capture the moment in the history of the peasant life in Kingdom of Yugoslavia at the time which the so-called peasant communities were falling apart under the pressure of industrialization, changes, modern life, and so on. So what is again interesting, she managed to preserve that material. She took it with her into the Italian part of, Italian-controlled part of Croatia at the time, and she managed to drag this suitcase full of papers and material to the United States. And there she got in contact. She actually went through New York, and I'm pretty sure that she listened to several lectures at Columbia at the time, but she actually moved on to Berkeley, University of Berkeley, where she worked not as a professor, but as a lecturer and as a researcher. And she continued to work on that material and published the book that I mentioned, Family in Transition, in 1964 or 66. It was published by Princeton University Press. There is a lot of material about that. She held it very, very close to her heart. And she was very proud of her achievement. Once she got back in the 60s to Yugoslavia, she continued to correspond pretty much with everybody who was somebody in the field of Slavic studies in the United States at the time. She worked briefly with Kerbler, and also she mentioned Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead. She wanted their work to be translated in Yugoslavia. This was not possible at the time. But definitely she was somebody who had an insight into what was going on in the field. And I think she was a very forceful in trying to sort of deal with the academic community in Zagreb, which was very reluctant to, at the point in the 60s and in the 70s, to open up to this type of research. So yeah, you're right.
Let me start from propaganda and how seriously they took it. You have to keep in mind that many of these figures whom you mentioned started their careers long before the revolution. So they are not like Jewish youth coming to the big city indoctrinated by some party ideology. Most of them were mature writers, poets, and cultural figures with their own program and agenda at that time. So, and then many of them contributed to the Soviet culture with what they considered was their work. They did encounter censorship and everything. They did work. They did fulfill the ideological orders of the party, but but they were serious artists. So it's I mean it's hard to say. It's probably not the right question to ask if they believed in what they wrote. They did, of course, as the artists, because they were honest. Right, Bergilson, yes, right. I agree, absolutely. And then for many of them, it was a matter of choice. So, and Mikhoels is a very good example. Mikhoels became an actor when he was 29. He lived 58 years. So half of his life, he was not an actor. Half of his life, he was an actor. Before he became an actor, he was seriously thinking, not even thinking, he was working very seriously on the thing which was unthinkable for a Jew in a late imperial Russia. He wanted to make a career as a lawyer, and he got into the most prestigious law school in the country in 1915, the law faculty of the St. Petersburg Petrograd University at that time. He finished it in 1919, and then he became an actor. And that was not a sudden choice. It's not it was the turning point in what he was doing, but it's not the whim. It probably, I see it as he was sensing that situation was changing. He wanted to become a lawyer, to be a political lawyer. He thought about legal profession as the way of making politics, not just being a legal professional. So acting, his acting is also a kind of politics. This is why he developed these ideas about actor as a politician, as a leader, and acting as a leading the audience, leading the people. And it takes me to the next question about how he represented the Jews. So, of course, he was a great actor. Personally, he hated directing, so we don't know about his great director's works. So, for example, Lear, where he played the main role, was directed by other person whom he invited from Leningrad, the great expert in Shakespeare's plays. Also, in terms of his repertoire, it's he never thought of playing Shylock, as for a question, but he thought seriously thought about Hamlet. He thought about Richard III, and he had different focus. His goal was not to represent the image of the Jews on stage, but rather to represent the Jews. And Jews felt this. So a lot of Soviet and even post-Soviet Jews, before the war, during the war, after the war, expressed their Jewishness as, we are proud because we have Mikhoels. This is why Lear is one of the perfect representations of the Soviet Jew. A proud Jew on the very top, in the main role, on the central stage, in the central city. So Soviet Jews would never say, well, we have Kaganovich, this is why we are proud, Soviet Jews. No, Mikhoels. During the war, if we don't have any documents who appointed Mikhoels to the position of the head of Soviet Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. There is no orders, there is no documentation about this. But he was the head of this committee. Ehrenburg, who was Stalin's trustee and given by Stalin very important assignments, was a member of the committee, but not the head of the committee. Mikhoels was natural figure as the head of the committee, and Russian Jews just wrote to him, seeking his assistance, his help, his support, and it was not, again, back to propaganda and beliefs. I think it's not that the historical circumstances pushed Mikhoels or Stalin or Stalin's police accused him of this leadership aspirations. He consciously wanted to become a leader, and he became a leader, and he took his leadership seriously, and he did whatever was in his power to do this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I saw that Professor Francois gonna, no? Okay. So I think that we can finish this session. Thank you very much for all participants and especially for the authors of the presentations.